After I refused to hand over my company's equity to my spoiled sister, my own mother locked eyes with me and whispered a threat that chilled my blood to ice. The mahogany table sat between us like a courtroom bench. My mother sat at the head of it, back straight, hands folded, a string of pearls catching the light from the chandelier above her. My father sat to her right, tumbler already half empty, ice cubes sweating a ring onto the wood. My sister Bianca sat across from me, thumb scrolling her phone, waiting for a number to land in her lap the way numbers always had. The pot roast had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. Nobody had touched it since the plates were served. This dinner had never been about food. "We need to talk about the family's future," my mother said, setting down her water glass with a small, deliberate click. "About fairness." "Fairness," I repeated. "Your sister has been through a lot this year." My mother's tone stayed even, rehearsed, the voice she used at charity galas when she was about to ask for a bigger check than anyone expected. "The wedding planning alone has been a strain. Jason's family isn't in a position to help the way they should." 40%, my mother said. "That's the family's ask." I set my fork down on the linen. 40% of what? "Your company." She said it the way she'd say, "Pass the salt." "Bianca has sacrificed enough watching you succeed while she struggles." Bianca didn't look up from her phone. She hadn't struggled a day in her life that I hadn't personally financed with my own silence. "It's not a gift," my father added, swirling what was left of his scotch. "Think of it as repayment. Every dollar this family put into you growing up. Tuition, the car, the wedding fund we never used on you because you never got married. It has to balance somewhere." I looked at him and felt something in my chest go very quiet. The particular stillness that comes right before a decision you already know you've made. 40% of a company valued at $140 million, $56 million, handed to a woman who had never held a job longer than 8 months because my parents had decided unilaterally, over pot roast, that my success was a shared family asset and my sister's failures were an invoice. "No," I said. The word landed flat in the dining room, over the low hum of the ceiling fan and the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound I'd grown up measuring the length of arguments by. My father's tumbler cracked against the table, a hairline fracture spidering up the glass. "Excuse me?" he said. I said no. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. "I built that company alone. I'm not signing anything." My mother didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. She leaned across the table, close enough that I could smell her perfume, and her eyes locked onto mine with a stillness I'd only seen once before, the year I turned 19. "We'll just extract it then," she whispered. I laughed, because it sounded absurd out loud. Extract it, like I was a tooth, like I was something they'd put in years ago and were now owed the removal of. I didn't understand yet how literally she meant it. 3 days later, my accountant called me at 6 in the morning, his voice climbing an octave with every sentence. Someone had filed paperwork with the state naming my company a subsidiary of my parents' failing real estate firm. $250,000 had moved out of our operating account overnight into a numbered account in the Caymans. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to him read the filing number back to me twice before I understood what I was hearing. My own signature was on the transfer authorization, a signature I had never made, the letters too round, the slant leaning the wrong direction, close enough to fool a bank's automated review, and nowhere close enough to fool me. I stared at the scanned copy on my laptop screen for a long time, my coffee going cold on the nightstand, the winter light barely up outside my window, and felt the particular vertigo of watching your own name get used against you by people who had known your real signature since before you could write it. That was the morning I stopped being anyone's daughter and started being a plaintiff. My name is Josephine Whitfield. Everyone but my mother calls me Jo. I was 31 years old the night that glass cracked, and I had spent nearly a decade building something my family would spend the next 6 months trying to take apart with their bare hands. I grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, in a house with a circular driveway and a mother who treated appearances like currency. Bianca is 4 years younger than me, and from the moment she could walk, she was the daughter my parents photographed. I was the daughter they deployed. By 9, I was doing my father's expense reports because he said I had a head for numbers. By 14, I was reconciling the books for his failing property management company on weekends, while Bianca had her nails done at the same salon my mother used. Nobody called it unfair. It was just how the house ran. My mother had a particular phrase she used whenever I asked why the rules were different for the two of us. "Bianca is delicate," she'd say, "and you're capable." At the time, I heard it as a compliment. It took me 20 years to understand it as an assignment. Delicate people get protected. Capable people get used. My mother had sorted her daughters into those two categories before either of us turned 10, and she spent the next 2 decades making sure neither of us ever crossed back over the line. There was a school fundraiser in 6th grade, a bake sale for the parent association my mother chaired, where I stayed up until 1 in the morning icing 4 dozen cupcakes because Bianca had promised the class she'd bring them and then forgotten. I never told anyone it was me. My mother took photos of Bianca at the table the next morning, radiant, credited as the baker, and hung one of those photos in the hallway for 6 years. I walked past it almost every day of my adolescence. I never once said anything. I remember, too, the specific afternoon I asked about the basement room because it was the only time I ever saw my mother look frightened instead of angry. I was 11, homesick from school, bored enough to go looking through parts of the house I normally ignored. The door at the end of the basement hallway had a padlock, an actual padlock, brass and heavy, bolted through the frame rather than the knob. I asked her about it at dinner that night, just curious, the way kids kids ask about anything unfamiliar. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. For half a second, before she recovered, her face did something I'd never seen it do before. A flicker of something underneath the composure, gone as fast as it appeared. "Christmas decorations and the good china," she said, too quickly, too smoothly. The sentence clearly rehearsed for exactly this moment, even though I'd never asked before. "Boring things. Don't worry about it." I didn't worry about it, because I was 11 and she was my mother, and there was no reason yet to build a room like that inside my head and wonder what else might be locked behind a door in that house. My father, Richard Whitfield, built his fortune in commercial real estate in the 80s and spent the next 4 decades slowly losing it through a series of developments that never quite closed. There was a strip mall in Aurora that sat half-finished for 6 years because the anchor tenant pulled out. There was a mixed-use tower in Rosemont that burned through $11 million of investor capital before the city pulled the permits over unresolved code violations. My father never talked about these projects as failures. He talked about them as timing issues, the market's fault, the city's fault, the bank's fault, anyone's fault but his own. My mother, Eleanor, sat on the boards of 3 charities and 1 country club and treated both as extensions of her personal reputation, a portfolio of appearances she managed with the same discipline other people apply to actual money. Whitfield Grove Holdings, my father's firm, had been underwater for years by the time I was in college. I only found that out later, when it mattered, when a receiver's report laid out, line by line, just how long underwater had actually meant. Bianca's boutique opened when she was 23, funded with $60,000 of my parents' money and a lease my father co-signed. It closed 19 months later, $41,000 in debt, and nobody in my family ever used the word failed. They called it a pause. They funded her next venture, a candle subscription box, with another $35,000. That one lasted 11 months. I started my company in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in the West Loop the same year Bianca's boutique closed. I called it Faro Systems, a supply chain compliance platform for mid-size manufacturers, and for the first 2 years, I paid myself $1,100 a month and drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a windshield crack that grew an inch every winter. My mother came to visit exactly once, looked at my apartment, and said, "This is what you're doing instead of settling down?" There was an earlier incident I didn't understand the shape of until much later. I was 26. My father asked me to co-sign a business loan, $400,000, told me it was for working capital at Whitfield Grove. I was building my company off savings and a small angel round at the time, and I didn't have $400,000 sitting anywhere, but my credit was clean and my income was climbing, and he said the loan just needed a strong second signature to clear underwriting. I signed it in his study on a Tuesday, without reading past the first page, because he was my father, and I had spent my whole life being told my job was to make things easier for this family. I found out 6 years later, buried in a discovery document, that the $400,000 never touched Whitfield Grove. It went straight into Bianca's boutique, into her candle company, into a Range Rover lease, and into a $14,000 deposit on a wedding venue for a wedding that got called off 8 months later. My name was on the paper. My credit carried the risk. Bianca never signed anything. At the time, I didn't know any of that. I only knew that my parents called me reliable and called Bianca fragile, and that reliable people don't get thanked. They get relied upon. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine. There was another piece of it I didn't understand the shape of until much later either. Something involving my mother's younger sister, Louise, who I'd only ever known as the aunt who sent birthday cards 2 weeks late and never came to Thanksgiving. Louise lived in Peoria, ran a small dental hygiene practice, and had what my mother always described, with a faint curl of her lip, as modest means. At a family funeral when I was 24, I overheard Louise in the kitchen, her voice low and tight, asking my mother when the money from the line of credit was going to be paid back. My mother laughed it off, called it a misunderstanding between sisters, and steered her toward the dessert table. I didn't think about that conversation again for 7 years. I had no reason to. Nobody explained it to me, and I didn't ask, because in my family, you learned early which questions got answered and which ones got you sent out of the room. By the time my company crossed $140 million in valuation in January of that year, I had stopped expecting my parents to be proud of me and started merely hoping they'd leave me alone. Neither happened. My father called the office a scam that hadn't been caught yet. My mother called it a phase that had gone on rather long. And then Bianca got engaged again to a decent, quiet man named Jason Cole. And suddenly my company stopped being a scam and started being a family resource. That was the dinner where my mother asked for 40%. That was the dinner where I said no. That was the whisper that started the war. The forged subsidiary filing was step 1, and it should have been enough to end things right there, because it was a federal-level fraud, and I had the paper trail to prove it. I drove to Winnetka the same afternoon my accountant called, my hands tight on the wheel the entire 40 minutes, rehearsing sentences I never got to use. My father didn't deny it when I confronted him in his study, the same room where I'd signed the loan 5 years earlier. He didn't even look surprised to see me. "If you'd just signed the papers we asked for," he said, not looking up from his desk, "we wouldn't have had to restructure your assets." Restructure. That was the word he used for $250,000 moved offshore without my knowledge. "That's theft," I said. "That's family," he said back. And for the first time in my life, I understood that we were using the same words to mean mean two completely different things. Do you understand what you've done? I asked him. This isn't a loan you're late paying back. You forged a corporate filing. You forged my signature on a wire authorization. That's a federal crime, Dad. He finally looked up. There was no fear in his face, only a kind of tired irritation, the look of a man being asked to explain himself to someone he still, on some level, believed he owned. You were always going to be fine, he said. You've never once in your life been in real trouble. Let your sister have this. I stood in that study a long moment, looking at the framed photo on his desk, the four of us at a lake house when I was maybe 7, all of us smiling like the picture wasn't already a lie. Then I turned and left without saying another word, because I understood, standing there, that there was nothing left to say that he hadn't already decided not to hear. I called the SEC that afternoon. I didn't yell. I didn't cry in the car, though I wanted to. I sat in the parking garage under my own office building and made the call in a voice so calm I barely recognized it, and I gave them everything: the filing number, the offshore account, details my accountant had pulled, the forged signature. An investigator named Renata Ochoa took my statement and told me an inquiry would open within the week. I thought that was the end of it. I thought my parents, faced with a federal filing, would fold the way people fold when the consequences finally arrive at their door. I had spent 31 years underestimating my mother, and I wasn't done yet. The second attack came 4 days later, and it wasn't financial. It was personal, and it was precise in a way that told me someone had been planning it for longer than 4 days. I'd been naive enough in those first 72 hours after the SEC call to think the worst of it might already be behind me. I was wrong by a wide, expensive margin. My email got hacked on a Wednesday morning. Whoever did it didn't touch my personal messages. They went straight to my client list and sent out a fabricated security vulnerability report, formatted to look like it came from an independent auditor, claiming Faro Systems had an unpatched breach exposing customer manufacturing data. It was addressed to 11 of my largest accounts. 2 of them called an emergency meeting with their own legal teams by Thursday morning. My head of client success, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priya Nair, walked into my office Wednesday afternoon holding her laptop like it might bite her. Halverson Manufacturing is on the phone, she said. They want to know why an independent auditor is telling them we leaked their proprietary tooling specs. I read the report twice before I understood what I was looking at. Whoever wrote it knew our system architecture well enough to fake a plausible vulnerability, down to the specific module names, but had gotten one detail wrong that no real auditor would have missed: a database version we'd deprecated 8 months earlier. It was close enough to be terrifying and wrong enough to be personal. Nobody outside my own leadership team, and until recently, my own family, had ever seen an internal architecture diagram of Faro Systems. I spent 40 hours that week doing damage control I shouldn't have had to do. I brought in an outside security firm, ran a full audit, published the results publicly to every client, and watched 9 of the 11 accounts stay. 2 didn't. One of them was worth $410,000 a year, and the account manager who called to cancel apologized twice before he hung up, telling me he believed me, but that his own board wouldn't sign off on the risk. I still didn't have proof it was my parents. I had a hunch, cold and certain, sitting in my stomach like a stone. I responded the way I responded to everything by then, reasonably. I filed a report with our cybersecurity insurer. I documented everything. I told myself that whoever did this would eventually make a mistake, and I would be ready when they did. I got my proof indirectly, 6 days later, when my lead investor, a measured man named Harold Kim from Anchorline Capital, called and asked if he could speak candidly. He told me he'd received a phone call from a woman identifying herself as my mother, concerned, she'd said, about my state of mind, and whether the board had adequate oversight given my history of instability. Harold had known me for 4 years. He'd sat across from me during 2 board meetings where I'd walked the room through numbers nobody else in that building could have modeled from memory. He told my mother, politely, that he didn't discuss portfolio companies with unsolicited callers, and then he called me directly, because in 11 years of investing, he said he'd never once had a founder's own parent try to plant doubt about her competence with his firm. I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it secondhand, Harold said. But Joe, I have to ask, is there anything going on I should know about? I told him the truth, because the alternative was letting my mother's version fill the silence. I told him about the forged filing, the offshore transfer, the SEC complaint already underway. Harold listened without interrupting, and at the end of it, he said one sentence I carried with me for months afterward. That's not instability, he said. That's someone trying to make you look unstable so nobody believes you when you tell them what actually happened. That was the moment I understood my mother wasn't just attacking my company from the outside. She was trying to get to the people who trusted my judgment and quietly rewrite what they thought they knew about me, one phone call at a time, before I even realized the calls were being made. I thanked Harold for telling me, and he brushed it off like it had cost him nothing, though I knew enough about how these relationships usually work to understand that most investors, faced with even a hint of instability, would have quietly started hedging instead of picking up the phone to warn me. They made the next mistake faster than I expected, and it came in the form of a manila envelope hand-delivered to my office by a courier who couldn't tell me who'd sent him, only that he'd been paid in cash. Inside were photocopies of my private therapy records from when I was 19 years old, the year I'd had a breakdown so severe I'd taken a medical leave from college for a semester. I remembered that year in fragments even now. A dorm room I stopped leaving, a professor who quietly withdrew me from 2 classes classes so the failing grades wouldn't follow me. A therapist named Dr. Okafor who saw me twice a week for 6 months and helped me build myself back into someone who could function. Nobody outside my immediate family and one therapist's office was supposed to have access to those files. I never told my clients. I never told my board. I had built an entire identity, publicly and privately, around the idea that I was the daughter who never cracked. And now that identity was sitting on my desk in someone else's handling, its edges soft from having been photocopied more than once. Clipped to the photocopies was a sticky note in my mother's handwriting, the same slanted cursive she'd used on grocery lists my entire childhood, the same hand that had signed permission slips and birthday cards, and, I now understood, a wire transfer authorization she had no legal right to sign. Investors hate unstable founders. Drop the complaint or this goes to the press. I sat at my desk and read it 4 times. My hands were shaking, but my mind, strangely, went very still. This was the moment I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. My mother wasn't reacting to a bad dinner conversation anymore. She was running an operation, and somewhere along the way she had decided that the most vulnerable year of my adult life was simply another asset in her inventory, something to be filed away and produced later, when it would do the most damage. I called my sister that night, some instinct telling me she might not know how far this had gone. Bianca answered on the second ring, and when I told her what had arrived at my office, there was a long pause on the line. "Mom's just stressed," Bianca finally said. "You know how she gets when she feels like the family's being torn apart. She sent my therapy records to my office, Bianca, from when I was 19, threatened to send them to the press. I'm sure it's not as bad as it sounds. Mom loves you. She just has a weird way of showing it sometimes." "This isn't a weird way of showing love. This is blackmail. You always do this," Bianca said, and something in her voice sharpened, an old familiar edge I recognized from 100 childhood arguments. "You take one bad moment and turn it into this whole narrative where Mom's some kind of villain. She raised us. She sacrificed for us. Maybe if you'd just given her something to work with, none of this would be happening." "Oh, what would you have had me give her, Bianca? $56 million? It's not about the money. It's about respect," she said, and I could hear, underneath the words, an argument she'd clearly rehearsed with someone else first, phrasing too polished to be spontaneous. "You've always acted like you built that company all by yourself, like this family didn't give you anything. Dad paid for your college. Mom drove you to school for years." I hung up. That was the moment I stopped hoping my sister would be an ally and started treating her, sadly, as a variable I couldn't predict. I hired a private investigator the next morning, a former financial crimes detective named Sal Renner, who'd been recommended by my attorney, Walter Briggs. Walter had handled my company's contracts for 6 years and had never once, in that time, expected to be handling a case against my own parents. He met me at his office on a Saturday, no charge for the weekend hours, because he said flatly that this wasn't the kind of situation you asked a client to wait on. "If they've done this before," Walter told me across his desk, "there will be a pattern. People who do this once do it as a strategy. People who do it as a strategy leave a trail because they think they're smarter than the people looking for it." Sal was a compact man in his 50s who'd spent 18 years with the Cook County Financial Crimes Unit before going private, and he had a way of talking about fraud the way other people talked about weather patterns, without judgment, just structure. "Money doesn't disappear," he told me during our first meeting. "It moves. Somebody has to touch it on the way through. Give me 6 weeks in a retainer, and I'll show you every hand it passed through." Sal started with the loan, the $400,000 loan I'd co-signed at 26, the one my father had said was for Whitfield Grove. Sal pulled the disbursement records through a subpoena Walter filed alongside my SEC complaint, and within 3 weeks he had the full picture. Laid out in a spreadsheet, he emailed me on a Sunday night with a note that just said, "Call me when you're ready." None of the money had ever touched Whitfield Grove's accounts. All $400,000 had been routed, in stages, into accounts belonging to Bianca, or vendors tied directly to her. $88,000 to the boutique's initial build-out, $60,000 more spread across 2 emergency inventory wire transfers 11 months apart, $141,000 into the candle subscription company before it folded. The rest split between the Range Rover lease and a wedding venue deposit for an engagement that hadn't survived the year. Every disbursement routed first through a Whitfield Grove holding account, in and out within 48 hours, just long enough to make the paperwork look plausible to anyone who didn't check the timestamps. "This is what people mean when they say laundering," Sal told me, tapping the spreadsheet. "It doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's just money passing through a name that isn't really involved, fast enough that nobody downstream ever asks why it stopped there for a day and a half." There was something else in the disbursement records that caught Sal's attention, something small that I almost missed the first time he mentioned it. A recurring line item, $840 a month, paid out of my parents' personal account to a storage facility in Bridgeview, a suburb 30 minutes from Winnetka. The facility wasn't near any of their properties. It wasn't near anything my family had ever mentioned. Sal flagged it as unusual and kept digging elsewhere, but I remembered something from childhood I hadn't thought about in years. There was a locked room in the basement of my parents' house, a room my mother always said held the good china and Christmas decorations, a room none of us kids were ever allowed inside. I'd asked about it once, at maybe 11 years old, and my mother's face had gone tight in a way that ended the conversation immediately. I hadn't thought about that room in 20 years. I didn't understand yet why it was surfacing in my mind now. now, next to a storage unit 30 minutes from that same house. I told Sal about the room. He wrote it down and said it was probably nothing. Neither of us knew yet how wrong that guess would turn out to be. My mother's third move came 2 weeks later, and it was the one that finally told me everything. The one that broke something in me I didn't know was still intact enough to break. Jason called me on a Tuesday night from a number I didn't recognize. A burner phone, I'd learn later, that he'd bought at a gas station specifically for this call. His voice was shaking. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to not tell Bianca I called." "Jason, what's wrong?" There was a long pause, the kind where you can hear someone deciding whether they can still take the words back. "I did one of those credit freezes for Poppy," he said. "A pediatrician recommended it, said it's routine now, protects kids from identity theft before they're old enough to notice. The freeze company flagged an existing account. There's already a credit line open in her name, $6,000 limit, opened 4 months ago." He told me my parents had opened a credit line using his daughter's social security number, Poppy, 8 months old. My niece, who I had held exactly twice, who had my sister's same stubborn chin, whose entire financial identity, before she could speak in full sentences, had been used as collateral by her own grandparents. I sat on my kitchen floor with the phone against my ear and felt something in me go completely, permanently cold, colder than the whisper across the mahogany table had ever managed. "How did they even get her social security number?" I asked, though some sick part of me already knew the answer. "Bianca gave my parents a copy of Poppy's birth certificate and social security card last winter," Jason said. "For a college fund, they said. A 529 account they wanted to set up as a gift. There was no college fund, Joe. I checked everywhere. There's no account with her name on it anywhere except the credit line." Jason had found the account by accident, doing a routine credit freeze he'd read about online for new parents worried about identity theft. A freeze that had flagged an existing line already open in Poppy's name. "They're drowning," Jason told me. "Whitfield Grove is underwater by millions. The banks are calling loans. Your parents have been keeping this family afloat by taking whatever isn't nailed down. And I think Bianca half knows, and I think she's too scared to look at it directly." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment before I said anything. "Send me whatever you have," I said. "Everything. Documents, dates, account numbers. They'll never forgive me," Jason said. "They were never going to forgive any of us," I told him. "They were just deciding, one at a time, which of us they'd use up first." Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I texted my lawyer 2 words that night: execute it. Walter had been building the civil case in parallel with the criminal complaint for weeks by then, and Jason's documents gave us the last piece. An infant's stolen identity wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a pattern of financial elder-to-descendant fraud so severe that Walter said flatly over the phone that we were no longer talking about a lawsuit. We were talking about a federal case with multiple victims across 3 generations. Sal Renner called me 2 days later, and this time his voice had a different weight to it. "The storage unit," he said. "I got a warrant assist through Walter's filing. You need to come down here and see what's in it yourself, because I don't think I can describe this over the phone in a way that does it justice." I met him at a self-storage facility off Harlem Avenue in Bridgeview on a gray Thursday afternoon, 2 federal agents already waiting by the roll-up door with a court order in hand. The unit was 10 feet by 10 feet, climate-controlled, rented under an LLC my mother had registered 4 years earlier, under a name that meant nothing to anyone but her: Grove Point Holdings. Inside, stacked on metal shelving, sat what wasn't china. It was 6 bankers' boxes of financial records dating back 19 years, organized with the same obsessive neatness my mother applied to everything else in her life, each box labeled in her handwriting with a year range instead of a name, as if even in private she couldn't bring herself to write down what the contents actually were. Loan applications in the names of cousins who'd since cut off contact with my parents. A forged co-signature on a business line of credit taken out in the name of my mother's own sister, my Aunt Louise, who had died 4 years earlier without ever knowing her name had been used. The signature on the application a clumsy, hurried version of Louise's real one. The kind of forgery that only works if nobody who loves you ever thinks to check. There was a folder labeled, in my mother's handwriting, simply contingency, containing draft versions of the same subsidiary transfer documents that had been filed against my company, dated 11 months before that dinner where she'd first asked for 40%. Sal laid the pages out on the shelf between us, and I watched the dates in silence, doing the math twice because I didn't trust it the first time. 11 months. She had been planning this for nearly a year before she ever said the word extract out loud. The dinner hadn't been the beginning of anything. It had been the moment she finally decided the groundwork was solid enough to act on. The locked room in the basement, it turned out, was where the original documents had lived before Sal's search of public storage records forced my mother to move them. My mother hadn't been protecting Christmas ornaments in that room my whole childhood. She'd been protecting evidence, one filing cabinet at a time, of a decades-long pattern none of us had ever been allowed to see. I sat in Walter's office with the copies spread across his conference table and felt something shift permanently inside my chest. This wasn't a mother who'd made one desperate mistake under financial pressure. This was a woman who had built an entire second architecture of fraud, brick by brick, for nearly 2 decades, and who had raised 2 daughters inside that architecture without either of us ever knowing the walls were load-bearing lies. Walter went through the boxes methodically, laying out a timeline on a whiteboard while Sal narrated the connections. 19 years ago, a small line of credit against a family friend's landscaping business, $4,100, the earliest entry, almost quaint compared to everything that came after. 12 years ago, a larger loan against a cousin's dental practice equipment, $92,000, most of it funneled into a doomed timeshare investment of my father's. 7 years ago, Aunt Louise. 6 years ago, me. The amounts climbed steadily every few years, each new theft slightly larger and slightly more sophisticated than the one before it, the same pattern any fraud investigator would recognize, a system testing how much weight it could bear before something finally gave. This is what a habit looks like when nobody ever stops it, Walter said quietly, capping his marker. It doesn't stay the same size. It grows to fill whatever room it's given. He tapped the earliest entry on the whiteboard, the $4,100 against the landscaping business. Somebody could have stopped this 19 years ago for the cost of a hard conversation. Instead, it grew into this. I thought about the therapy records. I thought about the sticky note. Investors hate unstable founders. My mother hadn't been protecting the family's reputation that day. She'd been protecting an operation, and I had simply been the latest asset she needed to bring back into line, the same way she'd once brought Louise into line, and the cousin with the dental practice, and however many other names were still waiting for me somewhere in those 6 boxes. 5 days after Sal's discovery, my parents' attorney requested an emergency mediation, framed as a chance to resolve this as a family before it becomes something none of us can undo. I knew what that meant. It meant they'd finally understood how much we had, and they were trying to buy a settlement before the SEC and the federal prosecutors Walter had been coordinating with got there first. We met at their attorney's office on the 28th floor of a high-rise on Wacker Drive. I wore a plain black suit. I carried a legal pad I didn't need and a small recorder in my jacket pocket that I very much did. Its use cleared with Walter beforehand under Illinois' 2-party consent laws, my own consent standing in for the second. Walter waited in the hallway outside, close enough to intervene, far enough to let me walk in on my own. My father slid a non-disclosure agreement across the table before I'd even sat down. "You're burning this family to the ground over a misunderstanding," he said. I didn't sit. I stood at the head of the table, the same position my mother had occupied at every dinner of my childhood, and I looked him in the eye. "You stole $250,000 from my company," I said. "You used my identity to secure a loan you funneled to Bianca. You used my infant niece's social security number to open a credit line. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a spreadsheet. We can make all of this go away," my father said, tapping the folder in front of him. "Sign the release, agree to keep this private, and the SEC complaint becomes irrelevant. Your sister keeps her marriage, your mother keeps her name. Nobody has to know any of this happened. I don't want it to go away," I said. "I want it on the record." My mother's composure finally cracked at the edges. "Do you understand what you're doing to this family?" she said, her voice rising for the first time since the dinner months earlier. "Your father could go to prison. Is that what you want? For your own father to go to prison? I want the truth to exist somewhere other people can see it," I said. "You made sure of that the day you filed forged paperwork against a federally regulated company. I didn't build that trap. I just refused to help you hide from it." My mother rose from her chair. For one second, I thought she might actually cross the table. Her hand lifted, not fully, but enough. Enough that I understood in that instant exactly how much restraint had been holding her back my entire life, and exactly how thin that restraint had finally worn. The door to the conference room opened before her hand came down. It wasn't their legal team walking in. It was 3 agents in dark windbreakers, led by a broad-shouldered man who set a badge down directly on top of the non-disclosure agreement my father had just slid toward me. "Nobody move," the man said. His voice was quiet. The room went cold anyway. My mother's hand froze in midair, her face drained of color, porcelain sliding into gray in the space of a breath. She turned toward me slowly. Whatever restraint had been holding her together finally gave out entirely. "You did this," she hissed. "You ungrateful little parasite." "Mr. Whitfield, Mrs. Whitfield," the agent said, ignoring her entirely. "I'm Agent Marcus Boone, FBI Financial Crimes Task Force, working jointly with the SEC on an active inquiry into Whitfield Grove Holdings and related entities." My father shot to his feet, straightening his tie in a gesture so automatic it looked like muscle memory outliving the situation that had produced it. "This is a domestic dispute," he said. "My daughter is having some kind of psychological episode. She has a documented history." I felt the words land, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, not fear, but something closer to relief. He had just said out loud, in front of federal agents, the exact threat my mother had tried to use against me privately. He had shown them who he was without my having to prove a single thing. "Sir," Agent Boone said, flat and final. "Sit down." He set a leather folder on the table. "We've had eyes on the Cayman transfer for 48 hours, he said. "You didn't just move funds out of your daughter's company. You moved them out of an entity under active SEC review during an open federal inquiry, using a forged signature and a fabricated subsidiary filing. That's wire fraud and securities fraud, on top of whatever your daughter's civil attorney is bringing." The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the faint tick of my mother's heels shifting her weight on the carpet. My father sat down slowly, the fight visibly draining out of him, replaced by something that looked, for the first time in my life, like fear. "Am I under arrest?" he asked. His voice cracked on the last word. Agent Boone didn't answer him. He looked at at me instead. "We need you to come in for a formal statement," he said, "and there's something in the storage unit your investigator flagged that we need you to walk through with us. Chain of custody. Your name is on some of the earliest documents in that box, even if you never saw them." My mother's eyes found mine across the table one last time, and for a moment the mask slipped completely, and what was underneath wasn't rage. It was something closer to panic. The look of a woman watching a structure she'd spent 20 years reinforcing come down floor by floor. "You have no idea what you've done," she said quietly. "I have exactly the idea," I said. "I finally have all of it." 2 agents flanked my father as they walked him out of the conference room. My mother wasn't handcuffed, not yet, but an agent walked close beside her, close enough that everyone in that room understood she wasn't leaving on her own terms anymore either. Their attorney stood frozen near the window, the non-disclosure agreement still sitting on the table, useless now, a document written for a version of this meeting that no longer existed. I stood alone in the conference room for a moment after everyone had gone, my recorder still warm in my jacket pocket, and I realized I was shaking, not from fear, but from the strange, hollow aftershock of finally being believed. Walter found me there a minute later, still standing at the head of the table, and didn't say anything at first. He just pulled out a chair and waited until I sat down in it before he spoke. "You did the hard part months ago," he said. "Every step after the SEC complaint, you already knew where this was going. Today was just everyone else catching up." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him yet. It would take months before I understood that he was right, that the hardest part hadn't been the federal agents walking through that door. The hardest part had been the 80-hour weeks in a 400-square-foot studio apartment, choosing over and over to keep building something of my own, instead of quietly accepting the smaller life my family had already decided I should want. The fallout moved faster than I expected and slower than I needed. Within a week, the SEC inquiry into Faro Systems was formally closed with a finding that my company had been the victim of fraud, not the perpetrator of one, a distinction that mattered enormously to my board and my investors, and not at all to the part of me that had spent a month being accused of instability by my own father in front of federal agents. The financial cleanup took longer than the legal cleanup. Our insurer required a forensic accounting report before releasing any cybersecurity claim related to the fake vulnerability disclosure, a process that dragged on for 11 weeks and cost nearly $30,000 in audit fees before a single dollar of the claim was paid out. The receivership overseeing Whitfield Grove's remaining assets required me to file as a formal creditor, alongside Aunt Louise's estate, the cousin with the dental practice, the landscaping company from 19 years earlier, and 4 other names I didn't recognize until Sal cross-referenced them against the boxes. There was something strange and almost clarifying about sitting in a room with strangers who had all, in one form or another, been quietly used by the same 2 people, watching a court-appointed receiver read out amounts and dates that had shaped all of our lives without any of us ever comparing notes. Whitfield Grove Holdings was placed under a court-appointed receiver within 10 days. The storage unit records, cross-referenced against banking subpoenas, showed a pattern stretching back 19 years. Co-signed loans against at least 6 relatives, 3 of whom had since died without ever learning their names, had been used. A decade of skimmed contributions from the Lakeshore Children's Foundation board my mother had chaired, totaling just under $90,000 over 8 years, and the $400,000 loan against my own name that had funded Bianca's ventures one after another, each failure quietly absorbed and hidden behind the next. My father was charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and identity theft. My mother was charged with conspiracy, identity theft, and once prosecutors connected the dots on the charity board embezzlement, a charge that had been sitting dormant, unfiled for 6 years because the foundation's previous director had quietly resigned rather than create a scandal for a family that golfed with half the county's judges. Bianca called me 11 times in the first 3 days after the mediation. I didn't answer any of them. On the 12th call, I finally picked up, mostly out of exhaustion, and listened to my sister cry in a way I hadn't heard since we were children. "They used Poppy," she said, over and over, like she couldn't get past the sentence. "They used my daughter's name. I didn't say I told you so." There wasn't a version of that sentence that would have helped either of us. I just listened, and somewhere in the 3rd or 4th minute of her crying, I understood that my sister hadn't known, not the scope of it, not the storage unit, not Aunt Louise, not the 19 years. She'd known enough to look away. She hadn't known enough to see the whole shape of what she was looking away from. Our extended family split almost immediately along lines I couldn't have predicted. My father's brother, my Uncle Dale, sided with my parents publicly and privately, sending me a single email accusing me of airing dirty laundry for attention, a phrase that would have stung more if I hadn't already read the storage unit inventory, listing his own name on a defaulted loan guarantee from 11 years earlier, a debt he apparently still didn't know had been quietly settled using money skimmed from the Lakeshore Children's Foundation. My mother's cousin Priscilla, someone I'd met maybe 4 times in my life, called me out of nowhere to say she'd always suspected something was wrong in that house, and thanked me for finally proving it. Family, it turned out, wasn't a fixed thing. It was a set of allegiances that only became visible once something forced everyone to choose a side. Jason became, unexpectedly, the person I talked to most in those weeks. He'd risked everything calling me that Tuesday night, and he kept risking it, cooperating fully with Walter's team, handing over every document, every account statement, every piece of paper that connected his daughter's stolen identity back to my parents. He told me once, over coffee near his office in March, that he'd married into a family he thought was simply cold, distant in the way some old money families are distant, and it wasn't until Poppy was born that the coldness started to look, up close, like something closer to a strategy. Bianca eventually cooperated too, once the shape of things became undeniable even to her. She sat for a deposition in April and answered every question truthfully, including the ones that made her wince, including the question about whether she had ever known the loan behind her boutique carried my name instead of hers. "I didn't want to know," she said, according to the transcript Walter later showed me. "I think some part of me always knew, and I just didn't want to be the one who said it out loud." I understood that sentence better than I wanted to. There's a particular kind of blindness that gets built for you when you're young, one shelf at a time, by parents who benefit from you never learning to see past it. I'd spent 31 years being the daughter who saw everything and said nothing. Bianca had spent 27 being the daughter who was carefully, deliberately, kept from seeing anything at all. Neither version of us had actually been free. Bianca lost her boutique lease that spring when Whitfield Grove's assets froze mid-quarter. One more casualty of a company that had never really been solvent, only propped up by whatever it could quietly extract from whoever was closest. She took a job managing inventory at a home goods store in Naperville, her first job that hadn't been funded by our parents, and she told me over the phone, half laughing, half not, that she'd cried in the stockroom on her first shift, not from the humiliation of it, but from how strange it felt to earn something and know for certain that nobody was going to take it from her later. We started having dinner together every few weeks that summer, just the two of us at first, careful and a little formal, like people relearning a language they used to speak fluently as children. She apologized once in July, without me asking her to, for the phone call after the therapy records arrived, for the sentence about respect, for years of not asking questions she'd had every reason to ask. I told her I understood why she hadn't. I meant it. Understanding isn't the same as forgetting, but it's a real place to stand, and it was more solid ground than either of us had been given growing up in that house. By August, she started bringing Poppy to dinner, strapped into a portable high chair that took up half my kitchen table, and I found myself watching my niece grab at a spoon with the same stubborn, single-minded focus I remembered from photographs of myself at that age. Jason would text me afterward, most nights, some short, unremarkable thing, a photo of Poppy asleep in her car seat, a joke about the traffic on the way home, small evidence of an ordinary relationship neither of us had expected to build out of the wreckage of the one we'd both married and been born into. My mother's final desperate move came in May, 3 weeks before her arraignment, when she had her attorney send me a letter through Walter's office instead of contacting me directly, since a protective order barred anything else. The letter didn't apologize. It framed the entire ordeal as a misunderstanding born of my chronic emotional fragility. The same phrase, almost verbatim, from the sticky note that had started this whole unraveling. It asked me to consider dropping the restitution claim in exchange for her cooperation in the criminal matter. Cooperation that, Walter pointed out dryly, she was legally required to provide regardless of anything I decided. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to negotiate. The woman writing that letter and the mother who'd read me bedtime stories in a house in Winnetka were, I finally accepted, not fully the same person, and hadn't been for a very long time, maybe not ever. There was a night in June, alone in my apartment, when the grief finally caught up to the anger that had been carrying me for 4 months. I sat on my kitchen floor with a cup of tea going cold beside me and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the therapy records had arrived in that manila envelope. I pulled out an old photo album I hadn't opened in years, the one with the lake house picture from when I was 7, the same photo that sat framed on my father's desk. I looked at my mother's face in that photograph for a long time, younger, laughing at something outside the frame, her hand resting on my shoulder in a way that had once felt like the entire architecture of safety in my life. I wasn't grieving my mother's arrest. I was grieving the mother I had spent 31 years hoping might still show up, the one who might have looked at what I built and simply been proud. No percentage attached, no extraction required. That mother, I understood that night, had probably never existed at all, or had existed only in brief real flashes, quickly folded back into whatever version of her the ledger required. I was grieving a person I'd invented to survive childhood, not a person who'd ever actually been in that house with me. Grief, it turned out, doesn't require the thing you're grieving to have been true. It only requires that you needed it to be. The legal proceedings dragged through the summer and into the fall. I sat through 4 separate hearings that year, each one a strange, formal echo of the mediation room. My parents on one side of a room designed for exactly this kind of reckoning. Me on the other. Walter beside me taking notes he didn't need to take because he already knew every fact by heart. My father accepted a plea deal in August, 18 months in a federal facility, 5 years of supervised release, and full forfeiture of what remained of Whitfield Grove's assets to satisfy restitution across every identified victim, myself included. He didn't look at me once during the hearing. My mother fought longer, cycling through 2 attorneys before finally accepting a plea in October. 3 years reduced from the original charges, with restitution scheduled across a payment plan that would likely outlive her working life. The charity embezzlement charge alone cost her the one thing she'd protected above everything else for 30 years, her seat on every board she'd ever sat on, her name quietly scrubbed from 3 separate donor walls within a month of the plea hearing. The Lakeshore Children's Foundation issued a short statement statement to its members that October, thanking concerned parties for bringing irregularities to light, careful never to use my mother's name directly, the same instinct for reputation management that had protected her for 6 years finally, belatedly, working against her instead of for her. A local business reporter picked up the Whitfield Grove receivership story in September, and for about a week, my name appeared in print in a way I'd never asked for and couldn't control. The daughter whose company was allegedly used to conceal fraud, reduced to a clause in someone else's headline. 2 of my newer clients called to ask, cautiously, whether the coverage would affect their contracts. I answered every call myself, walked each one through the actual SEC finding, and lost none of them. Harold's firm issued a brief statement of confidence in my leadership that ran, unprompted, the same afternoon the article published, and I understood, reading it at my desk, that it was the first time in my adult life someone with real standing had defended me publicly without being asked to, and without wanting anything in return. My company recovered the $250,000 in full, plus interest, through the receivership process, though it took until September to clear. 9 of my 11 clients who'd stayed through the fake vulnerability report renewed their contracts that year at higher volumes than before, a strange kind of loyalty dividend I hadn't expected and didn't think I deserved, but took anyway. I sold the house in Winnetka that fall, the one my parents had lost to forfeiture, the one with the basement room that had held 19 years of evidence behind a door I was told, as a child, contained nothing but china and Christmas lights. I didn't buy it. I simply made sure, through Walter, that whatever proceeds remained, after restitution went toward the identity theft recovery costs for every relative whose name had been used without their knowledge. Aunt Louise couldn't be repaid. Not really. Not the way that mattered. But her estate received a formal restitution payment that November, and some cousin I hadn't spoken to in a decade called me, crying, to say thank you. It's been a year now since that dinner where my mother leaned across the table and told me, in a whisper, I still hear sometimes in the quiet hour before sleep, that she'd simply extract what she wanted if I wouldn't give it freely. I run Faro Systems from a real office now. 40 employees. A lease I no longer have to justify to anyone. I drive a car with an intact windshield. I still work long hours, but they're mine now. Chosen instead of survived. Harold Kim still checks in every few months, not about the business, just to ask how I'm doing, and I've learned to answer that question honestly instead of reflexively, which is its own small, strange kind of progress. Priya made partner track lead on our client team this spring. Sal Renner sends me a Christmas card every December with a joke about china cabinets that only the 2 of us understand. I see Bianca every few weeks. It isn't easy, and it isn't what it might have been if we'd grown up in a house that hadn't quietly taught both of us to compete for the same scarce approval. But she brings Poppy sometimes, and I watch my niece toddle across my living room floor, her identity finally, fully her own again, protected by a credit freeze her father set up the same week he chose, at real personal cost, to tell the truth. Jason and I talk more than Bianca and I do, honestly. 2 people who found each other on opposite sides of a family neither of us had built, and both of us were trying to survive. I don't talk to my parents. My father writes occasionally from the facility, letters I don't open. My mother has written twice. I read the first one and didn't finish the second. Walter offered to read them for me, screen them for anything I actually needed to know, and I took him up on it after the second letter, mostly so I could stop wondering what was inside without having to absorb it myself. He told me both letters were, in his words, more of the same, and I trusted him enough to leave it there. Sometimes, on the drive home from the office, I pass the exit for Winnetka and think about driving through it, just to see the house from the outside, the new owner's car in the driveway, whatever they've done with the basement room by now. I've never actually taken the exit. I keep driving past it instead every time, and that small repeated choice has come to feel like its own kind of answer. I don't think I need to see it to know it's just a house now, walls and a roof, no longer capable of holding anything over anyone. People ask me sometimes if I regret how far I took it, whether there was a version of that dinner where I could have said something softer, given something smaller, kept the peace a little longer. I don't think there was. I think the peace they were asking me to keep had never been peace at all. It had been a debt collection dressed up in the language of family, and debts like that don't stop being collected just because you finally learn their name. My mother's threat was supposed to be the moment she brought me back into line, the way she'd brought me into line my entire childhood, with a whisper instead of a raised hand, because a whisper left no mark anyone else could see. Instead, it was the moment I finally understood there was no line left worth standing in. I think about that whisper more than I expected to, a year out. Not because it still frightens me. It doesn't. I think about it because it was, in its own way, the most honest thing my mother ever said to me. Every other sentence she'd offered across 3 decades had been managed, curated, shaped for whatever audience was in the room. That one slipped out raw, unrehearsed, the actual architecture of how she saw me laid bare in 4 words. We'll just extract it, not ask, not earn. Extract, the way you'd extract a resource from ground that had no say in the matter. She looked at me across that table and told me she'd extract what she wanted, and in the end, that's exactly what happened, just not in the direction she meant. What got extracted was the last piece of the story I'd been telling myself about who my family was, the story where the coldness was just a personality trait and the favoritism was just bad parenting, and none of it was actually built, brick by brick, on purpose, over 19 years. That story is gone now, and I don't miss it, even though some nights I miss the comfort of believing it. What's left in its its place isn't triumph. Not really. It's quieter than that. It's a windshield without a crack in it. A niece who calls me by name. A sister learning to trust her own judgment again, one stockroom shift at a time. And a piece I built myself out of the wreckage of a whisper that was supposed to chill my blood to ice, and instead finally woke me all the way up.